Look, the United States has surrounded Cuba from all sides. Essential supplies like medicine, fuel, and electricity are almost exhausted, and the U.S. has imposed a complete naval blockade on the country. To support Cuba, a ship has departed from Russia. It is expected to reach Cuba in about 10 days. If the United States intercepts that ship, the chances of a major conflict could increase significantly. No one really knows how far such a war could escalate. But before we get into that, let's understand how the U.S. imposed sanctions on Cuba and how the Soviet Union once deployed nuclear missiles there. At one point, a nuclear war was prevented because of the decision of a single officer. Otherwise, the Soviet Union might have launched a nuclear attack on the United States. Now, let's break this down step by step. Cuba is a country located in the Caribbean region, close to North America. The surrounding body of water is known as the Caribbean Sea, and the countries in this region are called Caribbean nations. Cuba is one of the most important countries in this region. Cuba is known for its high production of sugar, which is why it is often called the Sugar Bowl. Geographically, it is located very close to the United States. It lies just south of the U.S. state of Florida, making it a highly sensitive location for American national security. Cuba is the largest island in the Caribbean Sea. It is rich in natural resources and is also a beautiful tourist destination. The country produces coffee and sugar, and Cuban cigars are famous all over the world. The island was discovered by Christopher Columbus, who was actually searching for India. However, he mistakenly arrived in this region and believed he had reached India. Seeing the local people, he assumed they were Indians. That's why the region came to be known as the West Indies. Later, it became clear that this was an entirely different part of the world. In 1492, Columbus arrived in Cuba. Soon after, Spain took control of the island and ruled it for nearly 400 years. During this time, the United States grew increasingly uncomfortable as a foreign power was dominating a territory so close to its borders. As a result, the U.S. began encouraging the Cuban people to rebel. They urged them to fight for their independence and drive out the Spanish, saying that no foreign power had the right to rule their country. The U.S. supported the rebels by supplying weapons and resources. In 1898, the United States passed the Teller Amendment, promising that it would not take control of Cuba. Trusting this assurance, the Cuban people intensified their struggle and eventually forced Spain out. However, in 1901, the U.S. introduced the Platt Amendment. This allowed the United States to intervene in Cuba's internal affairs and to establish a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, a base that still exists today. Cuba officially became independent in 1902. At that time, Theodore Roosevelt was the president of the United States, and Thomas Palma became the first president of Cuba. However, his government largely operated under the influence of America. In the years that followed, most Cuban leaders remained aligned with U.S. interests. In 1933, Fulgencio Batista came to power. He strongly favored American interests and opened Cuba's resources to American businesses. As a result, public dissatisfaction in Cuba began to grow. Coffee plantations, sugarcane fields, sugar mills, and even the tourism industry gradually came under American control. Foreign influence over the country's resources kept increasing. Under these conditions, the Cuban people became deeply frustrated with Batista's rule. Meanwhile, many Americans came to Cuba, built businesses, and made significant profits for themselves. After this, Cuba gradually turned into a hub of luxury and underground activities. Gambling became widespread, prostitution expanded rapidly, and everything seemed to spiral out of control. As a result, Cuba's reputation began to decline across the world. Most of Cuba's land and resources fell into the hands of foreign interests. The country became a center for alcohol, gambling, and excess. Meanwhile, ordinary Cuban citizens were struggling with unemployment. This growing injustice led to rising anger among the people against their ruler, Fulgencio Batista. Batista ruled from 1933 to 1959, and during this time, he focused heavily on protecting American interests. But suppressing public anger was not easy. It was during this period that a new leader emerged on the stage of history, Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro would go on to lead Cuba for nearly the next 50 years. He launched a powerful movement against Batista, using guerrilla warfare, rebellion, and strategic attacks. After a long struggle, in 1959, he took full control of Cuba. A country that once operated under American influence had now become completely independent. But this marked the beginning of new tensions. The United States did not accept Castro. Castro followed a communist ideology where the government controls the country's economy and resources, similar to systems in China and Russia. In contrast, the U.S. system is largely based on private ownership. This ideological clash made the situation even more intense. Now, here's the major turning point. On January 1st, 1959, Castro made a bold announcement. All American banks in Cuba would be shut down, American companies would be closed, and all private property would be nationalized. In other words, Cuba's resources would belong to the Cuban people. Overnight, American companies were forced to leave Cuba. For the United States, this was a major humiliation. At that time, the U.S. president was Dwight Eisenhower. He was deeply angered and began planning to remove Castro from power. To carry this out, the U.S. intelligence agency, the CIA, launched a secret operation. They trained around 1,500 rebels, many of them loyal to Batista, and equipped them with modern weapons. This force was known as Brigade 2506. The plan was highly strategic. Infiltrate these rebels into Cuba, create unrest in different regions, and make it appear as if the Cuban people themselves were rising against Castro. This plan was put into action on April 17, 1961, through the Bay of Pigs invasion. But things did not go as expected. Local fishermen noticed suspicious movements and alerted the Cuban military. Castro's forces responded quickly and launched a counterattack. At the same time, American B-26 bombers were painted with Cuban markings and used to attack targets, an attempt to make it look like Castro was attacking his own people. However, Castro's forces were prepared. They shot down several aircraft. Soon, the entire plot was exposed. Around 100 people were killed, and nearly 1,400 were captured. When the truth came out publicly, the U.S. operation was completely exposed. This became a major embarrassment for U.S. President John F. Kennedy. But the story didn't end there. The United States launched an even more aggressive plan, Operation Mongoose. This operation ran for several years, starting in 1961. Its objective was to destroy Cuba's economy. Factories were sabotaged, sugar mills were burned, bridges and roads were blown up, and power plants were targeted. The goal was to create unrest among the Cuban people and turn them against Castro. During this time, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev stepped in to support Cuba. This made the situation even dangerous, gradually pushing the world closer to the possibility of a devastating global war. What followed was even more destructive. Cuba's grain warehouses and factory storage facilities began to be targeted with hidden bomb attacks. But these attacks were not carried out from outside. Agents of the CIA would secretly infiltrate from within. They would approach workers and offer them money, saying, "Just store this package in the warehouse." The workers believed it was ordinary cargo, but in reality, it was a bomb. Moments later, it would explode. Poor workers thought, "We're getting so much money for such a small task," never realizing they were being used as tools of destruction. In this way, large-scale sabotage spread across Cuba. Power plants were blown up, factories were destroyed. The CIA even set up a fake radio station, broadcasting messages like, "We are rebels, we will overthrow the government of Fidel Castro." But Castro was not someone who would break easily. None of these efforts had any real effect on him. So the United States changed its strategy. They imposed strict economic sanctions, an embargo designed to isolate Cuba. Other countries were pressured not to trade with Cuba, and those who did faced consequences from the U.S. The goal was simple: increase unemployment and inflation so that ordinary people would turn against Castro. But the result was the opposite. People rallied even stronger around him. Next, the United States adopted another tactic. Through the CIA, paid protesters were brought onto the streets, shouting slogans like "Down with Castro." At the same time, propaganda campaigns spread false narratives, claiming that Castro was corrupt and a bad leader, but the Cuban people did not fall for it. Then came one of the most extreme phases. U.S. President John F. Kennedy, working with the CIA, allegedly approved numerous plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. It is often claimed that there were over 600 attempts to kill him. Castro loved cigars, so explosive devices were reportedly hidden inside cigars, designed to detonate when lit. In other cases, poison was said to have been used, in cigars, drinks, coffee, and food. He enjoyed swimming, so there were plans to poison his diving suit or oxygen equipment. Even the microphone he used for speeches was allegedly targeted with explosives. There were also claims of attempts involving barbers, doctors, and even hidden weapons inside media cameras. Women were reportedly sent as part of honey trap schemes to get close to him and assassinate him. Yet, remarkably, Castro survived every attempt, as if he always sensed the danger in advance. Because of this, it is often said that the number of assassination attempts against a single leader in history is almost unmatched. He went on to rule Cuba for nearly 50 years. As a result of these actions, the Cuban people grew increasingly hostile toward the United States. Castro, in turn, took a firm stance against America and moved closer to the Soviet Union. At that time, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev strongly supported Castro. Meanwhile, the U.S. was also working to counter Soviet influence around the world. At the same time, the United States secretly deployed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, known as the Jupiter missiles. Turkey was located just a few hundred kilometers from Soviet territory, which dramatically increased tensions. U.S. President John F. Kennedy believed this gave America a strategic advantage, but the Soviet Union was not going to remain silent. Amid rising tensions, an advanced American spy aircraft, the Lockheed U-2, was sent to monitor Cuba. It was equipped with cutting-edge sensors, specialized systems, and high-altitude capabilities, making it one of the most advanced surveillance planes of its time. But Cuba eventually became aware of this surveillance. And then, at one critical moment, they shot the spy plane down. At that moment, Fidel Castro gave the order, "Shoot down every aircraft." One after another, advanced American reconnaissance planes were brought down. This only made the United States even more furious. However, a few aircraft still managed to reach Cuban airspace and carry out surveillance, and what they discovered shocked America to its core. They found that Russia had already deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba. Think about this. The United States had earlier placed missiles in Turkey aimed at Russia, and in response, Russia installed missiles in Cuba directly targeting the United States. In simple terms, two superpowers were now pointing nuclear weapons at each other. Tensions inside the United States reached extreme levels. President John F. Kennedy was under immense pressure. He declared, "We will not let Cuba go." The U.S. then made a strategic decision. Instead of directly attacking Russia, it would surround Cuba completely. A massive naval blockade was launched. Outer layers, inner layers, multiple defense rings. Cuba was encircled from all sides so that no ship could enter. But Nikita Khrushchev made it absolutely clear. No matter how strong the blockade is, Soviet ships and submarines will reach Cuba. And just like that, Soviet submarines began their journey. The entire world watched in silence, because if U.S. naval forces and Soviet submarines came face to face, war would be unavoidable. The peak of this tension came on October 27, 1962, a day many believed could be the end of the world. On that day, American warships and Soviet submarines came dangerously close to each other. U.S. ships suspected that enemy submarines might be lurking underwater, so they began dropping explosives known as depth charges to test the waters. Depth charges are underwater explosives designed to destroy submarines nearby. But fate had something terrifying in store. Right beneath those explosions was a Soviet submarine, B-59. The explosions disrupted its communication completely. Contact with Moscow was lost. No signals, no instructions, just silence. And earlier, they had been given strict orders. If communication is lost, assume war has begun and launch a nuclear strike. Inside the submarine, the most critical decision in human history was about to be made. A nuclear torpedo was prepared, but there was one condition. It required the approval of 3 senior officers. The first, Captain Valentin Savitsky. He said, "Launch the attack, destroy the United States." The second, Vasily Arkhipov. He refused. No, this could just be routine signaling, not an actual attack. The third, Ivan Maslenikov. He also opposed the launch. Just imagine, the fate of the entire world depended on one decision. Finally, it was decided they would surface the submarine and assess the situation. When the submarine surfaced, they saw American warships right in front of them. Both sides were on edge. One wrong move could have ended the world. In the end, President John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev opened communication. They realized it was a misunderstanding, not a deliberate attack. A peaceful agreement was made, and the crisis was diffused. But just imagine if Vasily Arkhipov had said yes at that moment. A nuclear weapon would have been launched, the United States would have retaliated, and then the world as we know it today might not exist. In the end, the 2 superpower leaders, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, reached an agreement. The deal was simple. We will withdraw our missiles from Cuba, and you will remove your nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy. Eventually, both sides stepped back. This is how the world narrowly escaped the devastation of nuclear war. But the story doesn't end here. While the world was trembling under the fear of nuclear conflict, one country was quietly strengthening itself. That country was Israel. Israel was secretly preparing to develop nuclear weapons at the Dimona nuclear facility. At some point, this information reached the United States. America did not want Israel to become fully self-reliant. Instead, it preferred Israel remain dependent on U.S. support for its security. At that time, John F. Kennedy personally called Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. He asked, "Are you developing nuclear weapons at Dimona?" Ben-Gurion denied it. He replied, "No, you are free to inspect if you wish." But before any inspection could take place, all evidence of nuclear research was removed from the facility. The United States realized it had been deceived. After this, America began increasing pressure on Israel. The pressure became so intense that Ben-Gurion reportedly took it as a personal insult. Then, the situation took a more mysterious turn. According to some theories, agents of Mossad allegedly infiltrated the CIA, and from there, a plot to assassinate John F. Kennedy was formed. November 22, 1963, a date that remains etched in history. While traveling in an open motorcade, President Kennedy was shot and killed. The accused was Lee Harvey Oswald, who was arrested, but just 2 days later, on November 24th, he was shot dead in public by Jack Ruby. After that, the case became shrouded in mystery. Although Ruby was sentenced to death, the sentence was never carried out, and he died under unclear circumstances in 1967. To this day, the incident remains one of the biggest mysteries in history. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, criticism of Nikita Khrushchev intensified. He had publicly announced the withdrawal of missiles from Cuba, while the United States quietly removed its missiles without much publicity. As a result, many people believed that Russia had backed down. Under this political pressure, Khrushchev lost power in 1964 and Leonid Brezhnev came to power. But during this same period, another major event unfolded. While the entire world was focused on the Cuban Missile Crisis, China took advantage of the situation. At that time, Mao Zedong was facing internal instability. A conflict abroad offered a way to strengthen his position. Taking advantage of the moment, China launched an attack in the Ladakh region and captured a significant portion of territory, what we now know as Axi-Chen. Even today, this region remains a major point of dispute between India and China. History does not stop here. In global politics, one pattern appears again and again. When major powers are distracted elsewhere, someone else seizes the opportunity to strike. Then the discussion takes a turn in a different direction. At that time, there was a growing belief that no one would come forward to support Pakistan. Many people started thinking this might be the perfect opportunity to reclaim POK. Now, let's return to the topic of the Cuban Missile Crisis. During that period, the United States stood with Pakistan against India. So India also began to think, why not apply some strategic pressure on America? That's why the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi traveled to Havana in the capital of Cuba and met with Fidel Castro. At that time, leadership of the non-aligned movement was in Cuba's hands, which was later passed on to India. The core idea of this movement was simple. We are not on America's side, we are not on Russia's side, we are completely neutral. This group came to be known as the non-aligned or the Third World. First World, America and its allies. Second World, Soviet Union and its allies. Third World, countries that did not take sides, mostly developing countries. Later, these countries came to be known collectively as the Global South. However, in reality, things were more complex. Even though Cuba was a leader of the non-aligned movement, it was largely aligned with the Soviet Union behind the scenes. Similarly, India, despite being officially neutral, often leaned towards Russia in many strategic matters. The foundation of this movement was laid by leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, Josip Tito, Gamal Nasser, and Sukarno. When India visited Cuba, Indira Gandhi received a grand welcome. At one point, Fidel Castro even embraced her. This moment was widely portrayed as a symbol of global South unity. Over time, these developing countries began to grow stronger. They became part of the G20, and an even more influential bloc emerged, BRICS. Many believe that BRICS could one day challenge the dominance of the US dollar in the global economy. Meanwhile, the United States repeatedly attempted to change the government in Cuba, what is often called regime change. But despite all efforts, they were never able to remove Fidel Castro from power. Even today, the U.S. maintains a presence at Guantanamo Bay under earlier agreements. What's truly remarkable is this. During Castro's rule, multiple U.S. presidents came and went, around 11 to 13 in total. Yet Castro remained firmly in power. From 1959 to 2008, nearly 50 years in leadership. In 2008, he handed over power to his brother, Raúl Castro. Raúl Castro ruled for about 10 years. So, overall, 50 years by the elder brother, 10 years by the younger brother, a total of 60 years of rule by the Castro family in Cuba. As of today, Cuba is led by Miguel Díaz-Canel since 2018, and it continues to be governed by a communist system. It is now being said that the United States has surrounded Cuba from all sides and is putting intense pressure on it. According to these claims, in order to weaken Cuba, the U.S. has influenced the situation in Venezuela. This matters because Cuba previously relied on Venezuela for its oil, petroleum supply. So if that supply gets disrupted, it naturally leads to a fuel crisis in Cuba. A large portion of Cuba's electricity generation depends on oil. Without oil, power generation is severely affected. In such a situation, roads can become empty, transportation systems may shut down, and even garbage collection services can stop. The most serious impact is seen in hospitals, because without electricity, MRI, CT scans, and X-rays, operating theaters, none of these can function properly. As a result, the healthcare system becomes critically affected. Similarly, schools, offices, everything can shut down, and the entire country may face a widespread blackout. In this situation, Cuba is believed to have reached out to Russia for assistance. There are assumptions that Russia may send oil tankers to Cuba. However, it's important to note that the global balance of power today is not the same as it once was. One very important point to understand: many of these statements may come from analysis, opinions, or even propaganda. Not all of them are fully verified facts. Global politics is extremely complex. It includes real facts, political narratives, and propaganda, all mixed together. At present, Cuba's economy has been facing long-term challenges: international sanctions, limited trade opportunities, and ongoing fuel shortages. Because of these factors, the country frequently experiences crises.